Well, we have decided, as we told those of you that were here last week, to continue with the chapters. So this week is Mind, the Great Discovery. And I learned a really valuable, did you read that one this week? Woohoo! It was powerful, wasn't it? Did you enter into discussions with each other about it? No, like we talked about last week. It is a powerful one. And all of this teaching is so awesome for conversation and pondering. And we do that often, but I've noticed the last couple of weeks, as David's been more and more into these quantum ideas and beyond, it's brought me down a rabbit hole. So last week I realized that I was really down the rabbit hole. I was pretty deep, and I didn't actually realize it so much until one day this week I found myself awakening from a space of not being aware of time or how much time I had been just sitting there, just staring out, or maybe my eyes were closed, I really don't know. I wasn't focusing and aware of I was in the abstract. I was not being aware of the objective, of form, of manifestation. And what that brought me to realize is that I'm very much about application of these principles. I'm not really so much into, although I love the discussions, and they grow me, I'm not really, I feel like I understand what I need to understand to put them into practice. And that's what I want to do. So I decided to come up out of the rabbit hole and stay up here for a while and share from that perspective. Because that space where we can go, we are there already. However we're living this life in our humanness, we are there already because we are already that spirituality that life is, that God is, that we call God. And in this teaching, we use so many different names for it that for me, it sometimes gets a little confusing with what exactly did you mean by that word mind, that word cause, that word spirit, because there are hundreds of words. And I said this once a very long time ago, and I'm reminding myself of it again this week, and that is, there is truly no word that you can speak that is not God. Everything, traced back to its source, traced back to its origin, is God. And for each one of us, as we get up in the middle of the night and read this teaching, we either reaffirm for ourselves the truth that is within us, or we grow our understanding of that truth to step into a new idea of some aspect in this human realm, in the objective world, the manifest world. And so I think we can get a little confused when we aren't understanding each other's language, each other's lingo. And it is important, I believe, during this time to really enjoy this human experience. It is a spiritual experience, but we get to experience in form. And that place where we can go in our mind, we can go because we're not really going anywhere. It's where we always have been, where we always will be. And so we're not going anywhere, even though it feels like we're having an out-of-body experience sometimes, and oh, what's been going on here? We aren't really. That is our life. That is the truth of who and what we are, a spiritual being that lives in the eternal and infinite. And in this human experience, God gets to delight in all the stuff that you or I decide we want or don't want. And that is a joy.
I'm sure God delights in our thinking sometimes, don't you think?
Especially yours.
Well, I do myself sometimes. I think, where did that come from? And that's kind of the whole point of the whole thing, basically, what we're talking about is where do our thoughts come from, and what are our thoughts actually? And Ernest Holmes says, the first great discovery man made was that he could think. This was the day when he first said, I am. This marked the first day of personal attainment. From that day, man became an individual and had to make all further progress himself. From that day, man had to work in conscious union with life. Now, I don't know if any of you took psychology classes, but I remember in college when I took my first psychology class, one of the first lessons was how do we think the way we do, and where did our thought processes come from? And we started out with the idea of nurture versus nature. You've all heard of that, right? Either we're born with everything that we know, or we acquire information as we go through life, and it's nurtured into us, or it just came from us naturally. Some people believe that babies are born into this life experience with all the information, all the intelligence of the universe, and we systematically drum it out of them, and so they can understand this human life experience. I think a lot of that comes from the Sophia concept of Gnosticism, in which a spirit comes into human form and must adapt to this human life experience, and eventually, because it's adapting to the human life experience, it kind of forgets its spiritual nature. And as it goes through life, it begins to remember things, and as it gets to the end of its life, it's suddenly remembering where it came from and longing to go back to its spiritual nature. It's a beautiful story, isn't it? Is that the truth of who we are? I happen to believe maybe that's very likely it, in a nutshell. Or maybe we just learn stuff as we go along. That seems kind of cold and not very inspiring to me. But imagine yourself as a baby waking up in this new life experience, and babies absorb information for quite a long time. They're not really self-aware. They don't really are aware of their presence in this life experience, but they are aware of things happening around them and to them. And eventually they begin to notice things and relate to things, and they may see that thing and notice that, wow, I think I'm making that happen. There's suddenly a spark of self-awareness, and they can look in a mirror and see themselves and go, oh, that's what I look like? And so as we go through life, we begin to collect information and then begin to process that information to actually create a sense of self-awareness. That's what Ernest Holmes is talking about when he says when man realizes he can think, or she, we realize that we can think. And suddenly we have thoughts, but then we have to think, well, where did the thoughts come from? Where are those thoughts that I'm thinking about? This morning as I was thinking about the talk, and I told Deborah I wouldn't talk about this in great detail, but I was thinking about details like this, and I was thinking about, for some reason, because of cause and effect, thinking about the law of relativity. And I actually figured it out, what Einstein was talking about, and why it was energy equals matter times the speed of light squared. And I thought, it makes sense to me. Now, I'm not going to tell you why. If you want to know, talk to me later. But where in the world did that come from at 6:30 in the morning today? Why did I suddenly figure out Einstein's law of relativity? I don't think it's from things people told me. I know I've read a lot of those kind of books and things about that information, but where did the thought come from where I could actually formulate in my mind, wow, it makes sense to me. I don't believe that it was necessarily from nurture. I think a lot of it had to do with the nature. It had to do with the idea that I am connected with universal intelligence back of this thing that I call my brain. Now, Ernest Holmes talks about the fact that the brain does not think. And he's not the only one that says that. If you talk to Joe Dispenza or Deepak Chopra or some of these other neuroscientists and doctors and scientists about what's actually happening in the brain, they actually probe the brain to find out where memories came from, which part of the brain certain memories are stored in, and they realize that there are different kind of areas, but they realize there are also places within the body. So if they probed your heart or some other organ, you store memories there too. And so maybe it's just all cellular memory. But then you talk to people like Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about morphogenetics, and he says that actually all the memory of the universe and all our memories are stored outside of the body in a field, in a morphogenetic field. And so our memories and our intelligence are not actually stored within us, but in the ether around us. And that's a pretty common, in a lot of spiritual traditions, that's a pretty common idea, that our memories are not actually stored in our brain. So our brain doesn't really do the thinking. So what is doing the thinking? Ernest Holmes says, behind the brain, there must be a thinker. And that thinker is the divine source of intellect, which is God. God is all that is. God is the one mind, and we are individualized expressions of that one mind, which we are still connected to it. We are individual PCs, personal computers, tied in to the internet of all that is. And so therefore we think exactly the same way that God does. We use the same intelligence, we just use it at a personal level. So memory of itself, as Ernest Holmes says, is an unconscious operation of what was once a conscious thought. This is one of the most important conclusions which the mind of man has ever made. And that's in all caps. This is one of the most important conclusions which the mind of man has ever made. By changing his thought, he could remold his affairs, and by right thinking, he could bring new conditions into his life. Because we are attached to the creative power of the universe. Our thoughts interact with the one thought of the universe. Ernest Holmes says, mind is both universal and individual, so that it is not only universal and abstract, it is also individual and concrete. The mind which is personified is the same mind which is universal. This has to do with our concept of race consciousness. Now, if you've been in science mind for a while, you know what race consciousness is. And we always have to describe this. When we go in classes, we have to define that as we're not talking about racial in terms of ethnic. We're talking about the human race. So the human race all shares an intelligence. And the reason we share that intelligence is because we are one with universal intelligence, so therefore we tap into it together. Because if we're all tapping into it together, it's like me getting on my computer and emailing somebody else. We all get the same information from the same source dropped into our houses individually. So we're all part of the one idea of all that is. We all have access to it. And so therefore we call it a race consciousness. Now Science of Mind has kind of changed that. And I'm doing the new practitioner class, and the new practitioner has changed that terminology. It doesn't use race consciousness anymore. It uses subjective consensus. So a memory is something that is on our unconscious level, and we all agree to those things that are on our unconscious level, because we don't, and not necessarily that it's unconscious in terms of we can't remember, we can't realize we're thinking about it, but we can pull up that information if we want to. We don't have to if we don't want to. It's always there. It's in the memory banks. We can get it if we want to, but it's not there all the time. So I like that idea, subconscious or subjective consensus, something that we all agree with, because we are all part of this human race together, this human essence of all that is. And so therefore we have ideas within our mind that we hold that are not necessarily conscious, but if we think about it, yeah, we can draw them up and bring them to the surface like memories.
So how do we apply this? Well, Ernest Holmes talks, and I'm paraphrasing, about our teaching being the study of life, the nature of the laws of thought, and the concept that we live in a spiritual universe, meaning God is all. Once well established, it becomes vital that we live this human experience by tapping into that law of mind consciously, not the subconscious, not the subjective, but the conscious aspect of our being in order to create the life that we love. And in science, and I found this interesting that today was mind, because I'm doing a lot in my classroom with science right now, with science experiments. And so in science, information is shared, and experimentation proves and gives us laws. And each one of us is a scientist. We are a mental scientist. As the laws become discovered by one of us, more and more of us try them, and more of us prove them. And as more and more people prove them, that's what David's talking about, that race consciousness, we create a agreed upon belief system. And this belief system is within us individually, and it also takes place as a group agreement, consensus. Ernest Holmes says that any law may be used by those who understand it. Any law may be used by those who understand it. So I'm going to share from the larger life, and I just love these little books. It's not real long, but I use...
Looks like your textbook.
Yes, it does. And I went back and read some of those notes this week too, and I was like, oh my gosh, did I write that? I like that. I have to say it again sometime. I'm going to use this one because it has been powerful in my life, as when I have worked with dis-ease of physical body. However, I believe that this writing from him is way beyond just the physical body. So if you are having any physical challenges, I invite you to apply this to that. If you are having any other kinds of things going on in life that you would like to shift into a new idea of itself and experience for you, then simply apply the words to that as dis-ease instead of disease. He writes, we shall be able to overcome our fear of disease only when we are positive in our own minds that disease is neither God ordained nor endowed with permanence. For me, I'm taking that just a little bit farther and saying, no longer believe in dis-ease. I no longer believe that that's possible for me. Now I'll tell you, there is a little trick that I've used in my life that I learned when I was revealing healing from abuse as a child. And this past Friday, we had a lockdown at school. I was not with my students because they were in a special area. So I was all alone in the classroom, in my hiding place. And while there, I was calming myself and praying for my little students that they were making wise decisions. None of us knew what was going on, and we were there for almost an hour, about 45 minutes. And so I was spending a lot of time in the calm, in the peace, in prayer. And it turned out to be nothing that I mean, obviously they felt the need to lock down, but it turned out to be no harm. So it's all good. The announcement that went out said it was unidentified person, thank you. Not my usual lingo. But when my kids came back, they said that they were unsettled. That wasn't their word, but unsettled, and they were feeling some angst, even though they had done a really good job. And they knew at that point that there was no cause for alarm or anything, but they were still feeling something in their bodies from the thoughts of what's going on and the down the rabbit hole places that those thoughts can bring us. And you may be able to identify with whatever things are going on in your life right now. So I gave them a little tool that I learned, and it was simply to become aware of your body. Your body is perfectly fine right now, right? You are not injured. You are not harmed. You are perfectly safe right here, right now, in this moment. Know that and breathe from and into that space of knowing that you are safe and all is well. And so Ernest Holmes goes on to say, then and not until then will we believe we can avoid or escape from illness. Not until we have overcome our fear of dis-ease. This for me is all about what our mind does when we let it go freely, when we don't keep it in check, and we just let it move freely in its own space. And so staying aware, I think, is really invaluable, aware of our thoughts and catching those unconscious thoughts and catching those thoughts that have become a part of race consciousness that we all believe or act as though we believe because we go along with whatever it may be. Becoming aware. And Sandy and I were talking last week, Reverend Sandy and I, about the words, a world that works well for everyone, and I thought this was a perfect tie-in. She shared with me that Reverend John Waterhouse, who we both like and enjoy, shared with her that it's a world where everyone knows how to use it. That's what he wants, a world. And I said, isn't that the same thing? Because for me it is, but for some it may not be. So someone else's words may not work for us. For me, a world where everyone knows how to use it is a world that works well for everyone, and I know I stick the well in there. Because we can't say good. A world that works good for everybody. Because for me that means a world that works God for everyone. And that's all we are anyway. So we might as well use it and use it well.